The president and his cabinet began to debate the full range of options for waging war.
As I went over to the White House and entered the Situation Room, it was a very somber group that was gathered there, needless to say. I had one great concern as I walked in that day, and
that is already what Mr. Bush had been thinking.
He made a decision fairly early on that as part of this whole process, for example, that we didn't want just a symbolic cruise missile strike on some training camp in Afghanistan.
Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld early on discussed the idea of making sure we have what's called boots on the ground. If you're going to go to war, that you got to go to war with all your assets. And I agreed completely with him.
But Mr. Bush had some reservations early on.
My biggest concern was that we fight and win a guerrilla war with conventional means. I was very aware of the fact that Russia had gotten bogged down in Afghanistan. I wanted to make sure that as we thought through how we were going to win this war, that we be very thoughtful and very deliberative and match our assets to the conditions on the ground.
A solution to the problem came not as might be expected from the military, but from the CIA. Director Tenet suggested sharing American technology and intelligence with the battle-hardened Afghan fighters hostile to the Taliban government.
The agency had relationships with a lot of these elements, the warlords, the leaders of the Northern Alliance and the Taliban. And the ability to work together using our intelligence assets as well as our new technologies.
It was unconventional and living in tents with some CIA and special forces with them. And we had a first world Air Force, the best in the world.
That's what the president wanted to know. He gave his war cabinet 2 more days to come up with a plan.
So I wanted to make sure that the plans that we had to execute the war, this part of the war, on this battleground, the plans were well thought out, and that so we didn't want to rush into it, and I want to make sure we looked at all angles, and we did.
And one of those angles was the need to gather as many allies around the world as possible.
I discussed the idea of putting a vast coalition together. The Secretary of State was anxious to do that. We saw opportunity to work with Pakistan in a new way.
It was clear that Pakistan was key to it because, one, Pakistan would give us bases and access. Pakistan had been a supporter of the Taliban. And
in all, the U.S. laid down 7 conditions for Pakistan.
I called President Bashar.
Key decision the president made was that you can rely on Bashar, that he'd be an effective partner going forward, and that certainly proved to be the case.
And another issue that came up early in the planning was whether the United States should strike Iraq as part of the first response.
there were some who indicated that they thought that the president, not seeing any linkage between the Iraqis and the Al-Qaeda attack on the United States, very firmly put down those suggestions early on.
Final analysis, the decision was made to focus on Afghanistan and the Al-Qaeda organization.
And why focus on Afghanistan only? Why narrow the focus?
Well, that was the immediate problem.
In this instance, we had to respond, and that direct attack came to us from Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, with the connivance of the Taliban, and that's what we focused on, and the president realized we have to do.
On the afternoon of September 12th, the president paid his first visit to the new battleground, the Pentagon, 184 lives had been lost in the attack here. One side of the building that symbolized American military might lay in ruins.
It was so painful to look at that hole, that gaping hole in the side of the building. And
they had rescue teams who were uncovering the bodies, and then the morgue team would bring them out.
Before Mr. Bush left, he made a point of speaking with the team recovering remains of the first casualties of war on his watch.
He tried to make them feel that he
at the same time, while we were there, I remember a great inspirational moment when a group of firemen up on the roof of the Pentagon unfurled a flag.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists.
In New York, hope was giving way to grim reality. Hundreds of firemen, doctors, paramedics, ironworkers were all pulling at the mountain of debris, but finding no signs of life.
About a couple of Port Authority cops.
The day before, it stood on top of Tower Number 1. Now it was planted in a mound of rubble at ground level. Late in the afternoon, a policeman carried an American flag to the mast. Firefighters wept as the stars and stripes flew in the smoke-filled sky. On Thursday morning, September 13th, the President spoke to New Yorkers by phone.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. President. Yeah, thank you all very much for taking my phone call. First of all, I can't tell you how sad I am and America is for the people of New York City and the tri-state area.
In a complete surprise to the White House staff, Mr. Bush promised Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Governor Ĝorđ Pataki that he would come to the city the very next day, a day he declared a national day of prayer and remembrance.
I wish I was visiting under better circumstances.
At the end of the call, the President took some questions from the press.
Could you give us a sense as to what kind of prayers you are thinking and where your heart is for yourself as you...
Well, I don't think about myself right now. I'm also someone, however, who's got a job to do, and I intend to do it. And this is a terrible moment, but this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy that came upon America.
I remember the President did get emotional, possibly the first time publicly, after the teleconference, and you could see that he was getting a little choked up. And
the President went back in his private study and I think just gathered his thoughts.
Mr. Bush had only minutes to compose himself before he had to move on to the Washington Hospital Center.
And he met the head physician there. I'll never forget, the doctor greeted the President by saying,
it's just a sobering moment for Laura and me, but is that the nation prays for those who have been injured during this unbelievable act of terror.
To the White House, there was another reminder of just how much America had changed in the last 2 days. The Secret Service believed that there was a credible threat that a large truck bomb was headed to the White House.
the director of the Secret Service, Brian Stafford, was standing in the doorway of the Oval Office. And he basically said, Mr.